It was 1975 when my Sunday school teacher, a chemistry professor at the community college, Fred Jappy, asked me, well, what do you think that it means if the Adam and Eve story isn't literally historical? We had talked about that in class. That wasn't a shock to me, but I didn't know. I said, well, what does it mean? And he said, it puts the emphasis on the individual. It becomes the story of each one of us. It's a story, a primitive story, a primordial, which means basic, deep, a true story, not a historical story. There's no actual Adam and Eve. It's from Genesis, the beginning of the Bible, the beginning of humanity. Genesis means in the beginning. In the beginning, God made humans and put them in the garden. God will keep the good garden. All the humans have to do is to enjoy, to be fruitful and multiply, which sounds enjoyable. It's like a story, like the ones told to and by children, naive, fairy tale-like, deep, true, like the fairy tales told to you when you were young, which Bruno Bettelheim says, speak the unspeakable and plumb the depths of our being. Once upon a time, we had it all, with no business more pressing than to be fruitful and multiply. Once upon a time, we were like children, naked but unashamed, trusting and unafraid. We were a 2-year-old, fresh out of the bath, romping gleefully naked through the living room, free of the unnatural restraint called clothing. So we were, undiapered and unashamed. The unself-conscious, trusting simplicity of children is the way that God created us, so the story says once upon a time. Let's look at what the story does and does not say. Like any good story, it doesn't explain, it narrates. Contra Augustine, this is not an explanation of how sin came into the world. The story does not say that the man and the woman were at one time sinless. It just says that they were naked and unashamed like children. They were only a few days old, remember. It is a story not about sin, but about self-consciousness. And because it's a story about human life, it's a story about limits. You are free to enjoy the garden, only stay off that tree over there. The story doesn't ask why that tree, we're only told it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it's a tree of limits. For what makes us different from God is that we don't always know what is good as God does. Because we're not God, we live with limits. Life has limits. The story doesn't say how or why, it just states what everybody eventually learns. Life, as good as it is, has limits. A, we don't know everything. B, we shall die. It depicts rather than explains our first human testing, pushing the limits. It's not a story about Satan. The creature is a snake, who in the first days of development was smarter than the man or the woman. After all, we were only a few days old. Like most smart beings, the snake was good at raising questions. Are you sure that God said, why would God create such a fine tree and not allow you to eat? Socrates said that the purpose of a good teacher is to raise the right questions, just like the snake. Good students will come up with the answers, just like the man and the woman, though Socrates gave us no means of knowing right answers. We don't need Satan or Socrates to raise questions given enough time. The snake is but a device to move the story along, to ask questions that are deep and threatening. Are there really limits to life? Maybe those limits apply to everyone else but me. Could a good God really say that we shall die? This is our human dilemma. God has created us humans, perhaps the highest of the animals. We have a wonderfully contoured cerebral cortex. Since Genesis, we have bypassed snakes. We can reason, ask why, all on our own, with no help from snakes. We can create and achieve, discover, invest. How can it be that creatures so marvelously endowed should also die? With all that we know, can Can there be something left which we cannot or should not know? Did God really say we should not eat of the fruit of the tree of good and evil, of life and death? You college students getting into UNCG or Guilford or Greensboro College or A&T, that's a fine achievement, but so did a lot of other people. While you're there, they'll teach you to split atoms and clone genes, translate Sanskrit, macro-manage the economy. And when you know that, they'll give you a degree, and you shall be like unto gods. Did God say there are limits to life in the garden? Surely not. Limits. This is the talk of primitive people, before science, before BC, before computers. The two humans, these wonders of creation, have been given the garden. Being creatures, there are things they won't know and they shall die, but having freedom, blessed with natural curiosity, they begin to push against the limits. Did God say that you shall not eat of the fruit of any of the trees? Asks the snake, grossly misrepresenting what God said. The snake, by the way, appears to be the world's first theologian, asking questions, answering for God. The woman corrects the snake. No, God said we are free to use all the trees except these two. But the thought had been planted. The snake has suggested the possibility of an alternate way to God's way. Can it be that God, who has gone to such trouble to create us, and so wonderfully created too, who has given us so many gifts, should also limit us? The natural God-given boundary is now perceived as a threat, a downright injustice. Death, the natural expected boundary of life, has become the primary human agenda. What can we do about the preservation of our life? We must get organized and do something. Take matters in hand. Get moving. You will not die, says the snake, moving from suggestion to outright rebellion. And why should we? It's not fair. So take matters in hand. We are told that we are creatures destined to enjoy the Creator, but as creatures, all we must do is trust. But we wanted knowledge more than trust. We were to entrust to God the meaning and significance of our lives, to let the Creator determine our destiny and worth as creatures. But that wasn't really good enough. What good is a garden if we shall die? Not content to be creatures, we became creators. Look at all that we can do and know if we just put our heads together. Go ahead, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Eat up, get wise. Now it's the Creator's turn to question, where are you? And the creatures give a pitiful answer. I was afraid. I was naked. I hid. We wanted knowledge more than trust. And look what we got. A forlorn creature shivering in the bushes, cringing in terror. We wanted to step over the boundary, stand up and be free. And for all of that, we know only one thing, namely, that we are naked. Ernest Beckman claims that all culture, art, science, industry, philosophy arises as a response to this primordial fact that we are naked. That is, despite our marvelous brains, we are fragile, exposed, vulnerable creatures who die. And now that we think that we have outgrown God, who is there to give meaning and purpose to our short lives? We must do it ourselves, says Beckman. So lacking immortality and security and meaning beyond ourselves, we write books, we do research, we build houses, we make clothes, we endow chairs at universities, we have children, we make war, we paint pictures, all as elaborate defense against the primordial awareness that we are naked and we are also afraid. Surely for creatures so wonderful as we are, something must remain, endure, something must have eternal value. All our cultural achievements, Becker says, are the pitiful product of naked apes. Our nakedness is no more apparent than in our pitiful attempts at self-justification through blaming. When asked, what have you done? The woman says, the serpent beguiled me. The man says, the woman gave me. We can't even admit our actions. It takes secure, strong beings to be honest. The lying and blaming reveal the real truth about us. I was naked and afraid. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment tells of a bright student who decides that he's smart enough to commit the perfect murder without being caught. He is intelligent, calculating, not like other weaker, less intelligent men. The novel is a story of his own self-destruction. He's punished not by the gods, but by the weight of his own offense. So in the birth of human self-consciousness and rebellion, man and woman are punished not by God, but by the result of their attempts to secure their lives by themselves rather than through trusting God. You'll be in terrible pain in childbirth, the woman is told. You'll have a desire for your husband, but he'll dominate you. This isn't God's will. God's will was for two companions in the garden, being fruitful and multiplying. Now relations between the sexes are confused, a matter of power plays, dirty tricks, domination, submission. Even the joy of children will cause much pain. To the man, you'll be at war with the earth. It'll bring forth as many thorns as fruit. You'll have to sweat and labor over the dusty earth your whole life and then return to it in your death. The dry, rocky, inhospitable land of the Near East stood in contrast to the once friendly world of the garden. Now, in this topsy-turvy world out of joint, men and women are at odds with one another, and there is no joy without much pain. And we die. We're naked now, more so than ever, lonely, nothing to secure us against the onslaughts of mortality. The story stands as an early critique of inadequate human attempts to overcome anxiety. It begins with man and woman losing their innocence, their childlike willingness to live as trusting creatures within God's creation. In the place of trust, we wanted knowledge, and look what we got. You who are young right now might feel quite vulnerable and afraid. You have lost enough of your innocence to know that there's a world of things out there that you don't know, that relationships between people are terribly confused. When you're young, you assume that your sense of vulnerability is a temporary byproduct of being young, that someday it'll be possible for you to acquire enough self-understanding, enough knowledge so that you'll know enough to be smart enough, adult enough to overcome anxiety. By college graduation, if all goes well, they would have succeeded in deceiving some of you into thinking that this actually happened to you already. That is, I'm all grown up now and can take hold of my life and stand on my own 2 feet because I got an A in organic chemistry. And yet someday, if you live long enough, you'll come to see that this was a great deceit, that in truth you are not strong and wise and self-sufficient, but in reality quite small, finite, mortal, namely naked and afraid. You'll be sitting in your den, dressed smartly in Gucci and J. Crew, a large house surrounding you, a single malt scotch in your hand, but you'll be naked. Your heart will skip a beat, and there'll be a strange sensation in your chest, and you will smell mortality. You will see yourself located not in some restricted Garden of Eden called Brassfield Estates, but in a Eden place where you're at enmity with the world, with other people, with life itself. And if asked why, you may blame your situation on your parents, or inadequate exercise program, or a lousy doctor, or your last spouse or partner, or even your education. Or you will say, if you can muster as much honesty as grandfather Adam, I was naked, I was afraid. Our attempt to know more is our effort to deal with our anxiety by circumventing the reality of God. If we can just know enough, get enough government research grants, build bigger and better systems of knowledge accumulation and dissemination, we can secure ourselves and carve some enduring significance for ourselves. What you don't know about skin cancer can kill you, says the poster on one of our bulletin boards. See, knowledge is the way to escape anxiety. This old story teaches otherwise, though. It's only God who creates and calls and permits, and only God who can deal with our deepest anxiety. It's a hard lesson for us to learn. We have been told that our greatest need is for autonomy and liberation and freedom, We're not likely to heed the call to trust. Most of what you've heard from the church are calls to action, to use potential, to achieve, and to live up to your great talent, and that is well and good. This story suggests, though, that way can be the problem instead of the solution. The story that says that any freedom that doesn't discern the boundaries of human life leaves us anxious. Any exercise of our potential that's not at the same time an admission of our boundaries is a waste because it's based on a lie. Our culture's attempt to resolve this anxiety is largely psychological, economical, or narcotic. Our public life is based on an exploration of our common anxiety. Witness the current national debate on whether or not we're going to bomb Syria back to the Stone Age. Our best politicians, theologians, advertisements are like a serpent that seduce us into believing that security is to be had apart from the reality of God. So in keeping with Kinsekuroi, I call you to listen to an old, deep, mysterious story of once upon a time. It's a story not about Adam and Eve, but about each of us. Because in each of us, in each of our lives, capitulates this primordial act of rebellion and self-deceit. This story has the power to shock us into the recognition that our lives are constituted and have enduring significance. Not because we have learned so much, but because we have learned to trust in the one in whom we live and move and have our being. Which brings us to the end of the story. Do you remember how it ends? The story ends not with the curse of pain and the enmity of thorns and dusty death. It ends with the Lord God, the Creator, the gardener, the accuser, when God becomes the Creator, the Tailor. God made for the two creatures clothes. God repaired their brokenness. Creatures who know that they are naked need clothes, some protective coverings, as they go out into a now difficult and bewildering world. God gives them what they need. God will not abandon them to their destructive delusions and their self-sufficiency. God promised to punish them by death, but God does not kill them. God's grace wins out, as it would many times again in our story. God refuses to give up on these two naked, frail earthlings. God gives them clothes, thus promises to continue to care for them even in their silly presumption. God gives us this holy good, even in our sin. So, finite, frail, naked we are, yes, says the story, but also loved. Preserved to live another day, clothed, fed, protected, in order to know not just the facts of life and death and good and evil, but trust. So, Psalm 90 prays, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days.